A woman kneels beside a fire that has burned low, holding a child who does not reach for her the way the other children do. He does not startle at the crack of a branch. He does not turn toward her voice. Somewhere behind her eyes, a question is forming that no language yet exists to hold: is my son different? And if he is, what happens to him now? That fire went out roughly 20,000 years ago. But the question didn't. On the surface, the question sounds simple. Could ancient people tell when a baby's mind developed differently than the rest? But underneath that question sits a stranger, sharper one. Did prehistoric humans even have a category for disabled at all? Or is that a modern box we're forcing onto minds that thought about difference in an entirely different shape? Here's the short answer, and it will surprise you. Yes, they noticed. Almost certainly they noticed early and often. But what they did with that noticing is where this story gets genuinely uncomfortable and genuinely beautiful. Start with the body, because the body is where this story begins. Human infants are born spectacularly unfinished. Compared to almost any other primate, a human baby arrives with a brain that is barely a quarter of its adult size, and it stays exposed, dependent, and watched for years. That watching wasn't optional. It was survival. A caregiver in the Paleolithic didn't need a diagnostic manual. She needed her eyes, her hands, and thousands of hours of comparison, because she had older children, nieces, nephews, the children of the whole group, to measure a new baby against. When does a baby usually track a face? When does a baby usually reach, babble, sit, walk? These aren't modern milestones invented by pediatricians. They're patterns woven into every human community that has ever raised children side by side. So the mechanism is almost embarrassingly simple. Humans are comparison machines. Difference doesn't require a word for disability. It only requires a baseline, and ancient communities, dense with siblings and cousins and shared childcare, had baselines in abundance. But here's the strange part. Noticing difference and labeling it as an impairment are not the same act. A baby who was slow to speak might have been seen as quiet, sacred, cursed, gifted, or simply late, depending entirely on the belief system doing the looking. Some societies folded neurological difference into the spiritual world, treating an unusual child as touched by something beyond the ordinary. Others treated the exact same signs as a warning, a danger, a mouth the group could not afford to feed. This is the trap historians constantly warn against, assuming ancient minds thought about bodies the way a 21st century clinic does. They didn't have our vocabulary of intellectual disability, autism, or developmental delay. What they had was something older and blunter, a running communal judgment about whether a child could, eventually, contribute, survive, and belong. That judgment did not always look like ours, and it did not always end the way we'd want it to. Which brings us to a cave in the Zagros Mountains of what is now Iraq, and to a Neanderthal known to researchers simply as Shanidar 1. Picture him not as a fossil, but as a man. He lived, by the evidence in his bones, with a withered right arm, likely blind in one eye, partially deaf, and carrying the healed scars of injuries that should have ended him decades earlier. And yet the bone had time to heal. Layer upon layer of remodeled tissue tells a story that isn't about survival of the fittest, it's about survival of the cared for. Shanidar 1 could not have hunted effectively. He could not have fully defended himself. By the coldest version of natural selection, he should have been a burden the group quietly let go of. Instead, someone fed him. Someone helped him walk. Someone, for years, decided his life was worth the cost. That's not sentiment. That's archaeology. So how do researchers actually build a case like this, not just for adults like Shanidar 1, but for infants, whose fragile bones rarely survive tens of thousands of years intact? The evidence stacks in layers, each one adding weight to the last. First, skeletal markers. Certain congenital conditions leave physical fingerprints, unusual skull shape, cranial asymmetry, bone density irregular for age. When paleopathologists examine an infant skeleton and find these markers, it's direct physical evidence, not guesswork. Second, burial context. How a community buries its dead speaks volumes. An infant interred with the same care, the same grave goods, the same position in a family plot as any other child tells us something about status and belonging. Third, the isotope record. Bone chemistry can reveal a child's diet across their short life, whether they were nursed longer than typical siblings, whether they received specially prepared soft foods. A prolonged nursing pattern, chemically visible in bone collagen, can hint that a child needed extended care beyond ordinary infancy. Fourth, population-level patterns. When researchers study cemeteries as whole communities rather than isolated skeletons, they can compare care investment across individuals. Some ancient burial grounds contain children who clearly received disproportionate resources relative to their apparent physical ability to contribute a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. Fifth, and most delicate, absence. Sometimes the evidence is what's missing a child who does not appear in the burial record at all, or who was buried apart from the group. Absence is evidence too, and it's the hardest kind to read. Each layer alone proves little. Stacked together, they build something closer to certainty and something considerably harder to look away from. Now for the piece that divides specialists. Some ancient skeletons, including certain well-known Neanderthal cases, show bone conditions that could indicate developmental abnormality, but could just as easily result from disease, trauma, or simple natural variation. One interpretation says, this is evidence of a community accommodating a disabled member for years. The competing interpretation says, we're pattern matching onto ambiguous bone damage, projecting modern compassion narratives backward onto data that's genuinely inconclusive. Both camps are working from the same fragments. Neither is being dishonest. This is simply what real science looks like at the edge of what bones can tell us. For hundreds of thousands of years, this is all we have: bones, chemistry, and careful inference. Then, astonishingly, the record changes shape entirely. Writing appears. And for the first time, instead of reading a skeleton, historians can read a sentence. Ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian texts contain some of the earliest direct written references to children born with conditions we would now associate with intellectual or developmental disability, sometimes framed as omens, sometimes woven into medical or legal texts describing how such children should be treated within the household. For the entire deep span of prehistory, we were inferring belief from behavior. The moment writing appears, belief finally speaks for itself. And what it says is complicated a mixture of superstition, law, cruelty, and tenderness, often within the same document. Here's where the story loops back around to validate the ancient evidence in a way few people expect. Modern developmental research confirms something ancient caregivers could only have sensed instinctively. Early signs of atypical neurological development differences in eye contact, responsiveness, motor timing are genuinely detectable within the first year of life, well before formal diagnosis is possible. The baseline comparison instinct of a Paleolithic mother wasn't primitive guesswork. It was, biologically speaking, tuned to real and measurable signals. But here's a caution worth sitting with. It's tempting to imagine ancient society as one single verdict machine, either universally cruel to disabled children or universally tender toward them. That flattens tens of thousands of years and thousands of distinct cultures into a single myth. Think of it this way. If you tried to summarize how modern society treats disability in one sentence, you'd fail instantly, because the answer depends entirely on which family, which country, which decade, which hospital you're standing in. Ancient societies were no less varied. A child born with a visible developmental difference in one valley might have been raised as sacred. In the next valley, under different pressures, under a harsher season, that same child's fate could have gone the opposite way. There was never one ancient answer. There were thousands. Two dimensions rarely make it into this story, and both deserve the light. The first is gender. In several archaeological contexts, evidence suggests caregiving labor for children with additional needs fell disproportionately on women not because of universal biology, but because of how ancient labor was typically divided. That means the someone who fed Shanidar I, who nursed a struggling infant longer, who noticed the differences first, was very often a woman whose name we will never recover, but whose judgment shaped the archaeological record we now study. The second is community size. Small, mobile foraging bands faced a brutal arithmetic that larger, settled societies didn't. A group of 20 people migrating on foot had a fundamentally different capacity to support a child who couldn't yet walk, forage, or communicate typically, compared to a village of 200 with stored grain and divided labor. Care wasn't just a moral choice. It was a logistics problem, solved differently depending on the size of the hands available to solve it. Which forces us to reckon with something uncomfortable. Survival math shaped compassion, not the other way around. A settled agricultural community with stored food had room for a child who might never farm. A band moving 40 miles behind migrating herds had far less margin for a member requiring extra care. This doesn't mean nomadic groups were heartless. The Shanidar case alone disproves that. It means the shape of compassion was constrained by the ground people stood on, the food they carried, and the miles ahead of them. We still make this calculation today. Every parent who has ever chosen a school, a therapy, a neighborhood, or a job partly around a child's needs is running the same ancient equation with different units resources against love, capacity against care. The tools have changed beyond recognition. Early intervention programs, occupational therapy, individualized education plans, all modern. But the underlying human motion, watching a child closely enough to notice difference and then rearranging your life around what you see, is not modern at all. It is one of the oldest behaviors our species has. There's something almost startling in realizing this question has never gone quiet. Every generation, in every corner of the species, has stood over a child and wondered, is this one different? And what do I owe them if they are? That we are still asking, tens of thousands of years and dozens of civilizations later, tells us something about what kind of animal we actually are. We are the species that watches its young that closely. We always have been. So how did ancient humans know a baby was mentally disabled? They knew the way any observant community knows anything about its children, through comparison, through thousands of hours of shared care, through bodies that occasionally left physical evidence behind, and eventually through words that finally let belief speak for itself. They didn't have our diagnoses. They had something arguably more honest, direct, sustained, communal attention. Return, for a moment, to that fire. The woman is still holding her son, and he still hasn't turned toward her voice. We will never know his name, or hers, or exactly what she believed in that moment. But somewhere in the layered bone and buried grain and healed fractures of the ancient world, we have her answer not spoken, but built. She fed him anyway. She stayed anyway. Long before medicine had a word for what made her child different, humanity had already decided, quietly and repeatedly, across 10,000 generations, that difference was not the same thing as disposability. That fire went out a very long time ago. The warmth it left behind never did.